Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am Arya and you are watching Unfinished Symphony. In this video, let's learn about separation of powers. So what is meant by separation of powers? Separation of powers means the power is being divided between different branches of the government. And the different branches of the government are the legislature, the executive and the judiciary. So when the power is divided between these three important organs of the government, we can say that there is separation of powers. So when there is separation of powers, the legislature will be performing their legislative function, the executive will be performing their executive function, and the judiciary will be performing their judicial function. And one branch will not interfere into the areas which are allotted to the other organs or the other branches. So this is the concept of separation of powers. Now consider this situation. Suppose if these three powers are vested in one person, then what will happen? For example, if the legislative power, executive power or the judicial power are vested in me, then there are chances that I may become a tyrannical ruler. I may be enacting tyrannical laws. I may be implementing those tyrannical laws or rules in a tyrannical way, and I may be taking decision according to my biased opinion or my own favor. So in that particular case, the result will be a tyrannical rule or an arbitrary government will be the resultant. So therefore, when there is no separation of power, then that will be leading to an arbitrary government. So this is why separation of power is very much important. Now while talking about the origin of separation of power, we can see that separation of power is having origin in the ancient time, and especially in the words of Aristotle, we can see the mentioning of separation of power. So Aristotle in his book, The Politics, he explained the concept of separation of power. And according to him, when the legislature and the executive are separated, then only there will be a stable government. And in order to have a stable government, executive must be separated from the legislature and other organs of the government. So that is the explanation of separation of power by Aristotle. So after Aristotle, years after, another one Greek historian whose name was Polybius, so he formulated the concept of checks and balances with the help of the concept of mixed government. And according to him, separation of power along with the checks and balances is the reason for the stability of a government. And he explained this with the help of the mixed government system. And he said that the reason why the Roman Empire was strong and stable, that was because of the separation of power along with the checks and balance system. And he said that in Roman Republic, there existed mixed government. Because in Roman Republic, the government consists of the consuls, the senate and the popular assemblies. The consul represented the monarchical character, then the senate was representing the aristocracy and the popular assembly was representing the democracy. Monarchy means rule by one person. Aristocracy means rule by few persons, and democracy means rule by many persons. So all these three governments was included in the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic, and that mixed government was the reason for the stability of Roman Republic or the Roman Empire. So this was the observation of Polybius, and he formulated the concept of separation of power and checks and balance mechanism from this concept of mixed government. And later, a French philosopher, Charles de Montesquieu, he propounded the modern concept of separation of powers. And according to Montesquieu, separation of power which is coupled with checks and balance mechanism is necessary for a stable government. And he said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Therefore, in order to have a stable government, there must be separation of power along with checks and balance mechanism by these different branches of the government. Therefore, when there is a fusion of power into the hands of a one particular person, that will be resulting in the absence of liberty. So when all the legislative, executive and judicial powers are vested in one person, then the result will be absence of liberty. So this was the concept of separation of power which was propounded by Montesquieu. Now while talking about the separation of power in different countries, we can see that in USA and Australia, there is rigid separation of power which is present. Especially in the earlier time, in USA, there was rigid separation of power. Article 1, Section 1 of the US Constitution says that the legislative power vests with the Congress. Article 2, Section 1 says that the executive power vests with the President, and as per Article 3, Section 1 of the US Constitution, the judicial power vests with the judiciary. Therefore, in US, we can see the rigid separation of powers. But nowadays, this has shifted to some kind of checks and balance mechanism. Thus, nowadays, in US, there is separation of power along with to certain extent there is checks and balance mechanism is also present. Now, talking about United Kingdom, in UK, in earlier time, there was no separation of powers and there was only fusion of powers. And the reason is the parliamentary sovereignty in UK. Because in UK, in earlier time, the British Parliament was sovereign or supreme. And British Parliament was able to make or unmake any law. And because of that parliamentary sovereignty, all the powers were fused into the Parliament. So there was no separation of powers. But now, after the enactment of the Human Rights Act, after the abolition of the post of the Lord Chancellor, and also after the establishment of an independent Supreme Court, we can see that in UK to a certain extent there is separation of power is also present. While talking about separation of power in India, we can see separation of power along with the checks and balance mechanism in India. Because in India, the different organs of the government, that is the legislature, executive and judiciary, while performing their respective functions, they also act as a check on the other branches. That is, when the legislature enacts a law which is against the constitution, then the judiciary play the role of an activist and judiciary can struck down that law as unconstitutional. So in this way, these three organs can act as a check on the other and thereby they can balance the power between them. Therefore, in India, there is separation of power along with the checks and balance mechanism is prevailing. So after comparing all these countries, we can see that no country is having 100% separation of powers. And in my opinion, separation of power which is coupled with the checks and balance mechanism is the effective method to have a stable government. So with this, I would like to conclude my video. Thank you.